their group, these sort of complex laws give them more latitude than we would like them to have. Yeah.
And you have that as well. And then I was actually talking to a security guard or a policeman who was stationed inside the courtroom that I was interning at, and he had no idea what he was doing. He was just there, just hanging out. He just had no knowledge of the law or any questions I had.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, you have a big. So one of the issues is if you were to pass a new law protecting people from electronic surveillance, guess what's going to happen? Tons of people are going to get thrown in jail because it's now a felony for electronic surveillance. And that means, monitoring a friend's email because you happen to know their password. That might be a felony. Or collecting other information, gathering stuff from their smartphone might be a felony. Yeah.
They're not currently felonies, but those things are very creepy. Please don't do them.
Yeah, you shouldn't do them. And you see that on Facebook sometimes when somebody gets on somebody else's Facebook account, and it's bad manners, it's improper, it's inappropriate, but should it be a felony? Should it be a crime? And so what Congress does is say, we really care about these. We want to show people we're serious. Stuff with minors, talking to minors, making them mad, irritating them, hitting them. What sort of things, if you try and so you want to protect kids, you end up throwing other people in jail. There's all sorts. So this is something the over-criminalization tied to electronic surveillance. Anytime you make a new law that makes things trying to protect people, you're doing this other stuff at the same time. You're making things more complicated. People don't know when they've broken the law. So here's a question. Our conversation, presumably is private, unless the room is being bugged. Could be bugged by the university to monitor rogue lectures that might show up from nowhere and talk to students. But what if it's bugged by a car, parked over there on the highway that's shining a laser beam? You know the story, a laser beam pointed at the window can record the vibrations. So you can, supposedly that's a concern. But here's my question. Is that electronic surveillance or photonic surveillance? Yeah.
Well, the laser might be photonic because they're monitoring the sound waves, but the recording method that they're using and then translating on the computer would be electronic. So it would be electronic surveillance.
So if they had an entire photonic computer that was doing on the other end, or analog or photonic, yeah, so I see what you mean. There's electronics involved. That's the point, regardless of whether you get the stuff through analog source or whatever. Okay, any other thoughts on this? Yeah, this is the same, what I mentioned before, expanded police power. I guess one way to look at this topic, what gives the federal government authority to do electronic surveillance? This came down to the earlier discussion of who owns the airwaves. That's, by the way, an interesting history. You guys don't know about, or don't know personally about the phone company. We used to have a monopoly phone company. Only one company, AT&T. And you couldn't own your own phone. There were people selling phones, and if the AT&T guy came to your house and found you had your own phone, they'd grab it and throw it in the trash and smash it with a hammer and all that stuff. You had to use AT&T and you had to use their phone, and they controlled the entire system. And for people that grew up in that era, that was normal. Government provided electricity, government provided telephone service, government provided water and sewage, different kinds of government, but it was just normal. Then came the breakup of AT&T and competitive firms, and every old timer complained about it. They said, oh, it's a big mess. I get all these bills and ads, and I don't know who to talk to. I used to have one company, it was better. But I mention this because how did the federal government how did Monopoly get control of the telephone? And it is an interesting history of utility monopolies. It used to be we had a highly competitive phone system. We had competitive power companies with lots of companies providing electricity, lots of companies providing phone service. And then came a campaign, a public relations campaign, funded by AT&T and Chicago Edison, Samuel Unsel of Chicago Edison. And they basically hired a public relations firm in Oregon, spent tens of thousands of dollars promoting the idea of natural monopoly. That some things that it's natural to have a monopoly. One phone company, one power company, one cable company. And that concept of natural monopoly was actually taught. It became part of the economics textbooks, the theory of natural monopoly. And that was through a bribe paid by an economics professor to include that chapter in his textbook. This came out in the Chicago Unseld trial. There was a debate topic in Ohio on whether you should have competitive utilities or regulated monopolies, right? Because the company said we need a monopoly and you can regulate us, but we don't want any competition. Anyway, there was a debate case in Ohio over free enterprise or regulated monopoly, and the free enterprise cases were winning. And the vice president of one of the utilities in Ohio was sent by the president out to this local high school debate tournament to find out why the wrong side of the case was winning. So this was a nationwide debate, and it's I did a proposal for the national debate topic on this with Nick Weller, who's a professor at UCLA now, or USC now. And we looked into the history of this, and because it was a question of how we should regulate utilities. Because right now, by law, you only have one cable company in your community. You can't have two. Usually it's one power company. Only I think Amarillo has competitive power companies, but most are monopolies. And government took over the phone company. So there was a book in 1903, How Ma Bell Lost Its Way, because AT&T's share was falling as all these competitive companies were increasing. Well, through lobbying, AT&T got this regulated monopoly. So we have this idea of natural monopolies that has existed ever since. And we just think that's normal. Now, the relevance to that for the debate topic is, in addition to monopoly of telephone and cable, we have government ownership of the airwaves, de facto ownership. And what that means is federal electronic surveillance isn't necessarily violating somebody's property rights if they're just monitoring their own system. Right? If the government owns the airwaves and it says we're going to monitor all the Wi-Fi networks for terrorists, and we own the airwaves so we can do it if we want to. Or they say we're going to monitor the cable systems for people using internet, and part of the condition for getting the monopoly cable contract through local government is allowing that to happen. So I just mention it because there's this interesting history. These electronic communications companies aren't private historically or were quasi-government. So, yeah.
Do you know if those contracts are available online, where the government has ownership of a certain, such as the airwaves?
So one of the articles I'm reading on that's a good question. Where is it here? Somewhere I'm reading, yeah, so, whoops. Okay, so, unfortunately this is this is from the Business of Television and Broadcasting Cable. If you search on, the article's titled The Public Airwaves Myth, and there's the author. And basically this is a history of the idea that the government owns the airwaves, because this is another whole story. There's a book on this. There's a couple recent books on this history, but you've got a big battle here between the modern liberals who say all this should be used for the public good. The airwaves, cable, everything, that we should be mostly concerned with the public good. And this whole story, this is coming up now with net neutrality is where the big debate is on this. So if you look at this, you'll find the FCC commissioners that are pushing for net neutrality, and basically the argument of the public ownership of the airwaves is what he takes to task. Originally, the radio stations were private. They were privately homesteaded. People would start broadcasting, and the argument is the government stepped in because of interference. Right? If two radio stations broadcast on the same wavelength, there's interference. It turns out, according to people who write on this, that they had worked this out on their own. Generally, there wasn't a problem. The government stepped in its zeal to sort of solve what they said was a problem. You can read that yourself, but the question of whether the airwaves are privately owned or government owned is one still to debate. The broadcast industry